Capitola, come to the coast with me. The sun and the sky are free. We'll play in the sand and sea. Capitola, paradise you'll adore. I'll take your hand there on the sand along the shore.
We are here at the home of Willa Dean Reynolds, who has many memories of the Capitola and Soquel area. Dean, thank you so much for being part of the Capitola Memories Project.
You're very welcome.
Tell me a little bit about your background. Where were you born?
I was born in, actually, because we were living at a fire station in Port Arthur, Texas, my mother decided to leave the area. The firemen lived right across. It was a duplex. The firemen were on one side and our little family was on the other side. And this was a satellite station. And so she picked up and took herself to her parents' house in Louisiana. So I was born 4 miles from Texas on the Louisiana side on Thanksgiving Day in 1926.
And so did you grow up in that area?
Yes. I grew up in Port Arthur, went to school there. Unfortunately, because I was born in Louisiana and there was a doctor that had to come from Texas and assist at my birth, although I beat him, I didn't have a birth certificate. And that has given me a lot of problems through the years until I finally got a passport and made it official. I got official papers. So I grew up in Texas, went to school there at progressive schools. It was a city about a little bit larger than Santa Cruz, I believe. It had oil refineries to make it go, and we were regulated by toots and whistles all through the day when the refineries were letting off people, and we knew exactly what time it was. But the smell was a little bit much too. When the wind was in the right direction, the smell was pretty bad.
So how did you come to leave that area and eventually move to California?
Well, it was the war, and it was a coastal town. We had an intracoastal canal that went right through Port Arthur to get to Beaumont, and all these ships came through. And there was a place called Orange, Texas, that although it had cows roaming down the streets at the beginning of the war, it also had a rich man who knew the right people, and he was able to bring a boat building company to his place, and they built DEs, destroyer escorts, for the Navy. And my husband commissioned one of those escorts, carriers, and he and his buddy were trying to find some kind of pleasures outside of Orange, which had one movie theater and a lot of people to see it. And so they would hitchhike from the road. On the road, they would hitchhike either to Beaumont or Port Arthur. I'm sure it was one road, and at one point, Beaumont went off one way and Port Arthur went the other, and they would take the car of either one. Whichever way they were going, they would hit a town that was a little bit bigger. We had 3 movie theaters in our town. So he was hitchhiking. He was picked up by a friend of a friend. And my best girlfriend came and got me, asked my parents if she could take me off to meet a sailor. It was rather daring. We weren't allowed to intermingle with the sailors at the USO. And so we took them to church. And they took us to dinner. And that was the beginning of a long friendship. So we had a correspondence, romance, back and forth until after the war, and he came after me. So he picked me up. We married in the church office, and not a very big marriage at all. I mean, wedding, no wedding at all. And we got on the Argonaut train of the SP, which was the alternate train. They had the Sunset Limited, but we didn't get that one. We got the Argonaut. It was older. It was inaugurated in about the 20s, and it was certainly not up to the Sunset Limited standards. It had seats that moved back and forward. You could either ride backwards or forwards. And but you could open it out so that 4 people could play cards on the table in between you. So it was nice, and it was a Pullman. So we had the make down Pullman seats every night, and we hit Los Angeles, where we got off and visited with his grandparents, and then we got on the daylight and came to Santa Cruz. Well, we got off at Salinas. Were met by a Greyhound bus. We got on the bus, and it seemed like it was immediate, so it must have met the train. And then we came on through Watsonville, where we had to change buses to get on one that came to Santa Cruz. And so we came in on the old Santa Cruz Highway, 2 lanes, and hit Soquel. And when we got to Soquel, my husband put me off at Parsons Liquor Store, which I didn't know if it was very respectable or not, but it had swinging doors that people were going in and out of, and so I stayed at Parsons Liquor Store corner, which was a corner of Porter Street and the Soquel Drive, and I stayed there while he walked the mile home to get his car so that he could come back and pick me up and take me home. And while I was waiting there, I got to look around this little town, and it was not very prepossessing, I'm afraid. It had looked kind of shabby. I guess it was its age, and since our town, Port Arthur, was it only dated from 1900, and it had grown up since then. It was a lot newer in all of its aspects in this town. And so the Red and White Grocery was kitty corner across the street from Parsons, and it was a corner, had that corner opening, and the old doors that were like screen doors and made noises when they slammed shut, and people were going in and out of there. And then Eddie Paretto's was across the street. Of course, I didn't know it was Eddie's, but his whole place looked like a ship. If you looked at it one way, it had portholes upstairs, and the family lived upstairs, and they had their 5 and dime downstairs, their variety store, and next to it was the old bank that it eventually closed it out and went to the Red and White store and built a new building. And so here I am on Parsons. Across Porter Street was Cunnison's Garage, which was just the service station. And of course, at that time, the service stations were just little cubby holes that had a roof that went out, and 2 stuccoed posts that held it up, and a couple of tanks, and that was it. But they had a big garage out back of it, and it stayed there for a few years. So my husband picked me up, and he took me back to his parents' place. And my husband had grown up where his father worked for powerhouses, and they worked for Southern California Edison in the Big Creek project. They were at Big Creek Powerhouse 8, and he was an operator of one of their machines.
Is that the Big Creek on the north coast of Santa Cruz, or
no,
a different Big Creek?
A different Big Creek, and quite a bit different. It was in the Sierras.
Okay.
And they had the San Joaquin River too that they were right on. And they built a dam there, and they gathered their people. They had them housed on site. They provided the houses, and there were about 13 families there, and they had just enough children to make a school. So they built, my father-in-law built a school there, and it was a one room school where I think they had about 5 to 7 children. And he got all of his education there until the 7th grade, and then they were facing high school. The schools ended at grade 8, and they had to go to high school. It was state law. So they would have to board their students out in Fresno or somewhere other satellite town, and they didn't like that. They couldn't afford it. They went through the Depression without any hitches. I think they went to a 4-day work week, but that was the only thing that had happened to them. So then they had always summered in Santa Cruz. So they came, that's where they decided to go. And so they came over here and bought property and didn't stay there. They sold property, and then they bought a service station with cottages out back. My father-in-law wanted to be a cabinet maker, and this was his big move. So he had this was the place that they bought. You can see Ruth. This was shortly after they bought it, and they had 76 gas. They sold 70, and they had 3 housekeeping cottages in the back. When we came to Santa Cruz, they were no longer taking in people because my father-in-law had gone to the war effort and was working in the shipyards, and my mother-in-law had taken a job at the post office. So they didn't really need cottages in, because that took a lot of care to keep them up and to keep them cleaned, and so we got one of the cottages to live in when we were married. There was no place to live in Santa Cruz. People were living in chicken houses that had been renovated, and we looked around for houses to rent, apartments, little places, anything, and there was nothing to rent. You couldn't even rent a room in a house. So we stayed in this cabin, and because my husband had saved money during the war, we were able to put in with the GI loan, we were able to put down enough money to buy a lot, which we, after shopping around, we decided on Monterey Bay Heights at the back. The golf course had gone out of business about 2 years before we moved up here, but we were still getting golf balls all over. But we bought the first house on Thomas Prescott's property that he had divided in, about 1928. But because of the Depression, and the war, they hadn't been able to sell it. So we were the first ones that got it, and we got the biggest lot. Except that some of the other ones saw the need to get double lots, and they did, and we didn't, and we should have, because the big lot turned out to be pretty small. So we went on from there. We got a man to come up and build our house. I designed it as a bride of 19. I designed the house that I didn't know was going to be my forever home, or I would have been a little more generous with the room sizes. As it was, I was trying to save money, so I saved by cutting down the sizes of the rooms. Bad mistake. And then we stayed here, so not many of our generation stayed in one spot. They would either build a house and buy it, and then they would sell it after a few years, and then get a bigger, better house, and then a few years later we get a bigger, better house, and that's how they got the better houses. We just kind of stayed here, and we stayed in our tiny little home, and then we added a bedroom, and then even later I added more space onto the back so that we have this nice, lovely studio that I'm in now.
Well, you found a perfect spot.
If we'd known that the back of the house was this sunny and bright, we would have built our house backwards to take advantage of it.
So where was the cottage that you first lived in?
It was on Soquel Drive. It was at 2565 Soquel Drive. And as I said, there were 3 cottages in the back. This one was a 2-story cottage. It was single wall construction. It had a tiny kitchen, a tiny bathroom, a big living bedroom area downstairs, and then up about 6 steps there was a half story upstairs. That was our bedroom, and we had to stay there for a year and a half while our house was being built. And it was built in 1947, and we didn't get into it until about October, this time of year in 1947. And we just had a baby at that time, so it was quite a move.
Now you, over the years, have taken quite an interest in Soquel history. How did you become interested in the history of the area?
Well, I've always been interested, and it seems like every time I met somebody, I met Lorraine Walker, who is a sister of Peg Nelson. They were the DeMonts of Soquel. Their father was a boxer that was famous all over here, this area. She started telling me a little about the area, and it seemed like I always didn't know anything. So each little snippet would be just a little bit more. And of course, my husband had lived here since 1936, and he knew everybody because he'd gone to school, high school here. But every time we'd meet them in a store or something, he would remember their names, so he would never introduce me, but he would tell me later, oh, well, yeah, he lives up Cherryville Road. That sounded really a keen area, Cherryville Lane. And they had cherries there, and I had never seen cherries before.
They don't grow cherries in Texas?
And not in my part of Texas. My part of Texas had swamps and and nothing but swamps, no trees, no forests. And not many fruit trees would grow there because it was so hot.
There are probably still quite a few apples being grown here when you first came, too.
Apricots. I wasn't aware of the apples until later. They grew more in Watsonville area. But apricots were very big here, and they were still a lot of prune trees. I found out when I started reading the old newspapers that prune trees were big crop in this area, all the way up to Summit Road. Things that we did for fun was to drive on Sunday. So on Sundays we would get in his little 1935 coupe, a Plymouth coupe, and we would drive all over the area, and we drove everywhere. We would drive up to Loma Prieta. We would drive the back roads of Watsonville. We would end up in Corralitos. There was no place that we didn't drive in this county, and it was just a pleasure to always drive. And people weren't so conscious of being trespassing on private property then. But we didn't go through any closed gates, but there were a lot of places we could go that weren't closed, and now you can't get to them, but it was fun. Then when we had the baby, we put the baby in the back of the coupe on the shelf, and we would drive with her there. Nothing about car seats.
So in general, how were Soquel and Capitola different in the late 40s and early 50s from today?
Well, when we drove into Soquel first on that bus trip, the first one, there were big gullies right by the side of the road, all the way to the little white church. They had so many oak trees growing in and around them, and the oak trees were green all year long, and I'd never seen any oak trees of that kind before. We had oak trees in Texas, but they were deciduous. These were evergreen, and they were very pretty and very, very green because it was February and it rained. I didn't realize that when we came here I wouldn't see rain for another 9 months. But at any rate, there were so many of these big gullies that have disappeared now. I think that Soquel must be over a big grid system underground that has all of these big pipes in the ground that I don't know what keeps them from getting plugged. Because starting with Monterey Bay Heights, you don't see any gullies, and they were just a fact of life. And of course, Soquel Drive was just, as I said, a 2-lane road, and it's now bigger. And going into Soquel, they've reconfigured the road quite a bit. We went up a hill that I found out by reading in newspapers later that was always, people were getting stuck on it. They couldn't get their wagons up and down this hill without getting stuck in the winter. And so that hill has been taken out. And now it's all flat to go by Capitola Avenue. And it's you'd never know that there was a hill there, and you used to have to go up over that hill where there was a county yard on the part that was next to the road. And it was quite a big county yard, and then the Capitola Avenue just went on down to Capitola. You had to go up the hill to get there. So 7th Avenue had a same configuration. It's quite different now. Then getting into Soquel, the little white church was there. and I don't know if it's been moved or not. It wouldn't surprise me if it hadn't been moved. I think I read something about it, but I don't remember now. But Soquel proper was, as I said, it looked kind of shabby. The buildings were old. The post office was on the corner of Main Street and Soquel. And across the street from it was Graham's service station. And remember, the service stations were only two little pumps in a small building. And next to it was Rushton's Grocery. And next to it was the Izant's gas works that they sold to build Izant's hardware on the opposite side of the creek. But this was on the east side of the creek then. And across Soquel Drive, next to the post office, was another grocery store. I don't remember his name, but it's the one that we shopped at, and it had a German proprietor, and he would give us a bottle of wine every Christmas. And Cherryville Lane is well, Main Street is just about the same. When it was laid out, I read this later, laid out by Hihn, and it's a mile long, and it ended in Hihn's Grove, which is now Pringles Grove, and it was it was straight. He made sure it was straight so you could race on it. They loved racing. So I didn't realize that, but that whole area has not changed much. The streets are about the same as they were. And the old San Jose Road has quite a bit changed. It goes straight up to Soquel High, and it used to turn at the 7-Eleven. It used to turn toward the creek, and there was a bridge there, but not in my time. It had gone down before then. And you go toward the creek, and then you would follow the creek to the graveyard, and then out. The papers have said, the old papers have said that Soquel was always muddy. It was so muddy that the kids couldn't get to school, so they had two different schools. One was on Granite Creek, up toward Glen Haven Road. It had the Glen Haven School, and then they had another school about where the high school is. It was a small school. And then I just read in the papers that I had, in about 1913, they consolidated these school districts into one, and they started going to the Soquel School that at that time I think was a two-story affair. And but that road is quite a bit different now. It's quite straight, and you'd never know that there was another road there.
Remember the Maddock's Bakery?
Oh yes, oh yes. It was. They had the best salt-raising bread that I've ever tasted. It was very good.
Was that already there when you moved here, or did it?
Yes, it was there. It was there, and I started using it right away. And I would go in there to get bread, and they would always give my children a big cookie, and it would be one of the big 3-inch sugar cookies. And I would buy their spice cookies too. They were the best spice cookies I'd had. Yes, it was very good.
Well, I remember getting one of those cookies when I was a little kid, so yes. They were still doing that in the 60s.
Oh, yeah, well, that's great. So, and we were still going there in the 60s, too.
Do you remember when the freeway going in?
Oh, yes.
To the late 40s.
Yes, it was. It took off cross-country, and it really divided the roads up quite a bit so that we couldn't get across everywhere we wanted to go. And even worse is that the kids couldn't get home from school easily. They had to go across that if they wanted to walk. And they would have to go across that construction area. You'd have to either walk down to Capitola Avenue and come that way, but they didn't put that bridge up right away either. So it was hard getting through there to get to the other side. So it was quite nice when it was finished, and very good.
Did you go over to Capitola quite a bit?
Yes, I did, and I was just talking about the Plum Tree was one of my favorite stores, and they had another one called the Pelican where I bought housewares. Every time I needed a gift, I would go there and buy housewares. But the Plum Tree had all sorts of nice things, that colored papers that I could buy, and arty kind of things. I really loved the Plum Tree. And then we would go on down into Capitola, and we didn't have much need for the other kinds of things they had there until we had visitors, and they always wanted to go to Capitola, and they loved shopping in those little corners. So it was fun. It was fun.
Did you take your visitors to the beach there very much? Or?
No, I'm not a beach person.
Not a beach person.
But I've gone to the beach there a couple of times, but I'm not a beach person.
And not a fisherman either, I guess.
No, my husband was. We fished in the Sierras, but we didn't fish. He liked to fish in the ocean, but his fishing trips were solo. He liked to fish from the pier, but then he had a friend, they would fish from the rocks in Santa Cruz, and he would bring home these blue fish that I didn't know what they were. The flesh was blue, and you looked at them and think, is this poisonous or not? And you cooked it and it turned sparkling white. It was so amazing. I think it was cabezon, but I'm not real sure.
Or maybe a lingcod. I think they have kind of greenish flesh. When
I
it's
have
raw.
seen that, and it could have been either one, but I know we got cabezon because they looked like an ugly catfish. And again, I wondered, well, catfish were good to eat, so I didn't worry too much about that.
Do you remember when they first started the Begonia Festival in Capitola?
Oh, yes, yes. We had a float in it. I was a Girl Scout leader. We had girls that wanted to participate, and as not just our troop, but our neighborhood, as they divided the divisions of troops into neighborhoods, our neighborhood decided to put a float in it. And somebody made us the basic float. They had some old oil cans that they fashioned a piece of plywood to, and there was our raft. And it was parked in somebody's backyard along Capitola Road and in the creek, and we would get out there. The girls would pick the begonias. They would take them to Vetterli's Gardens, and there was a place out on St. Andreas Road that was a big begonia area, and they would pick all the begonias. Everything on that thing had to be begonia. And us parents would get on this raft that went up and down, and you'd get quite seasick if you stayed on too long. And we would fashion these begonias on the raft on chicken wire that had been attached to the raft in the shape that we wanted it. We decided that our raft would be hands around the world, so we had a big globe world in the middle, and the Girl Scouts manned this raft with all the begonias on it and held hands around this world. They quite enjoyed it.
Well, that sounds like fun. It'd be nice to find a picture of that sometime.
It was in the paper, but I don't know if I have a picture of it or not. I'll have to look around and see.
Was that for one of the very first?
It was the first Begonia Festival, and it was quite nice. People came and they got all over the trestle, and they were just everywhere. It was just such a spectacular floating extravaganza. And it was the only one that I ever worked on. I don't know if any other scout troops participated in others after that or not, but we did our share of that one, and it was fun.
Were there quite a few floats that year?
Oh, yes, there were. There were maybe 10, 15.
I also wanted to ask you about the Soquel-o-rama. Do you remember that?
Yes, I have pictures of that. Yes, we went to a parade that they had for the Soquel-o-rama, and we have gone to other Soquel-o-ramas, one of which we got Frank Hill to draw us a cartoon picture of something, one of us, I'm not sure what. He was there doing his little thing. We got such a kick out of watching him. And we saw old cars. They were parked in a parking lot with their hoods up, and we enjoyed walking around. It was a lot of fun.
Now, I know there was a parade. What other kinds of things did they have for the Soquel-o-rama?
Well, they had wine tastings, I believe, and I know they had a kiddies parade. I think a couple of my kiddies went in it, and one of them decided at the last minute she wouldn't go in it. So she was walking around in costume and not in the parade. Another one went as a Martian, and she wore a colander on her hair with a paper straw through the middle to make a little antenna. And she quite enjoyed it. The kiddie parade was different from the big parade, and they did have a big parade because I have pictures of it, and they were quite stunning. It was 1968 that I got the pictures.
Well, you mentioned you were involved with the Girl Scouts.
I was with the Girl Scouts for 20 years, and we would meet at the youth center. I don't know if you remember, if anybody remembers the youth center. During the war, they had a USO center behind the library, and they'd built this building that was quite large. It was, I bet you, 50 feet long and maybe 30 feet wide, and they danced in there. They had a bar. I don't know if the bar served liquor. I don't think it served liquor. It probably served food. And they had stools around the bar, and they had two bathrooms, a man and woman's, and we got a closet in there for scouts, and we could keep our flag and our supplies in there. And we met in the big part of this youth center. They called it, after the war it became a youth center. And Boy Scouts, I guess, met there, and other Girl Scout groups. And we would pick up the key at the library and go in there, and it was all ours, and we could do anything we wanted there, and it was quite spacious, and it was quite nice. This floated away in the 55 flood, so we had it up until 55. I started in scouting when I was 20, and I just moved up here, and I was talking to Dorothy Prescott one day, and she was a Girl Scout leader, and I said, "Oh, I always wanted to be a Girl Scout." And she said, "Well, as a matter of fact," and she made a phone call, and somebody called me up, and I took on this troop, even though I didn't have any girls that were old enough to be in it. And we started meeting at the youth center, and had all these little girls around, and it was quite fun, and I stayed with it for over 20 years.
How about when your children were in school, were you involved with the PTA?
PTA, yes, I went to many. I was room mother for many years. Got to see all the little kids that grew up. You wouldn't believe the way they would grow up, what they looked like, become police officers. This shy little boy that was, I wish I could remember his name. I believe it was Terry something, and he became police chief for, I believe it was Watsonville. But here he was, a shy little boy, and you would never think that he would grow up to be a big burly police officer, and he was quite cute.
Well, tell me a little bit. I know one of the projects you were involved in was the newspaper indexing project. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was a branch. We started off as, I'm a genealogist, and I've had a lot to do with tracing my family roots. And we met at the main branch of the library where we have our genealogy room, and Sarah Bennett was an early genealogist, and she got together with friends of the library, and we became, they had a need to index newspapers. This was before they were digitized and before newspaper.com. We started, I'd say, about 30 years ago.
Around 1980 or something like that? 79, 80?
80 at least. And I started, my first book was for 1890, and it was the Santa Cruz, not index, but the early Santa Cruz newspaper.
This was a collection you did of articles about Soquel that you found while doing the index?
They were in these big, huge books that were bound together as books, and I started reading it, but they were dropping little tidbits about Soquel in it, such as Mr. Bennett, who had a sore toe, and he had a corn on the toe, and he decided to take care, as they put it, of the offending member by hatching it off. But he didn't do a good job, so he had to get the doctor to come and finish the job. But things like that. This happened to be Frank Bennett, and yes, he was named, but there were other things about people that weren't named, and like the boys catching fish out of the flume for the paper mill. And they had built a flume to bring water to the paper mill, and I don't know what this flume looked like. Evidently it was open because the boys could catch fish in it, and they would catch like 125 fish with their hands. So it must have been fun. But these things were being lost because they didn't have a name. You couldn't index them under subject, well, you could under fishing perhaps, but they were, nobody really, Sarah didn't want to fool with those.
Oh, I see. Well, the indexing was mostly the major news stories.
No, they weren't. They were, one man wanted to do the major news stories, but those came from out of...
Well, I'm talking about major local news.
Local news, yes, those. But there weren't very many of them, and they were short little articles and mostly about people. So we indexed by subject and by name. And it filled a need. Everybody really seemed to like what we were doing, and the historians particularly liked that. And so I started copying out by hand little items about Soquel. And I finally had enough to put into 3 books. I read 1890, the whole year, and 91, which was a centennial year, and that was a very good edition, and 92, and I read 93 until A.A. Taylor decided to take, there was talk about the capital moving to San Jose, the capital of California, moving to San Jose from Sacramento because it was too hot and they had too many flies, and so they were going to move to either Monterey or to San Jose, and he was going to be right there. So he moved over in 1893 to San Jose, and he took all of his paper equipment with him, and then they didn't move, so he moved back here.
So that was the Santa Cruz Surf.
Surf, yes, yes, it was. The Santa Cruz News with McPherson was not easy to get, and the surf was all there. So we didn't read the Santa Cruz News. It was the Republican, yes, it was a Republican news, and I believe that the surf was a Democratic news. They were very, very strict divisions. So if you wanted anything Republican slanted, you would read the Sentinel News, but if you wanted to read the Democratic side, you would read the surf.
I know they were fierce rivals.
Oh, yes. I believe that A.A. Taylor was the one that blackballed Mr. McPherson from getting in the Masons. It was really cutthroat. But it was funny. Somebody complained that they weren't getting enough news in the East Santa Cruz, and the little curt reply was, well, if they want more news, they'll just have to get their own newspaper. So it was kind of one-sided too, but they did have Soquel happenings. They would have news from the summit, but in columns of news and items and things. And those are the types of things that I got too.
Well, that's great that you, and of course that newspaper has still not been digitized, so.
Oh, hasn't it?
No.
Oh,
so,
I didn't know that.
The surf is, I still use those surf indexes. They're very valuable.
That's great. It's great to know.
Did you know my friend Marion Ash?
Yes, I did. She was one of our indexers, and she was a delightful person.
You recently came on a tour that I gave of Capitola for the DAR. Have you been a member of the DAR for many years?
Not for many. I've been since about 1996, somewhere in there.
Oh, okay.
I don't know, 20 years.
But your family must go way back in the American history.
Yes, it does. It's Southern all the way. Just mention Baptist ministers, and that's us. Hard rock Baptist ministers. I don't think they ever did anything wrong except on the, let's put it this way, they weren't angels. But they considered themselves angels, angelic.
I very much enjoyed the article you did for one of the history journals about Michael Lodge.
Yes.
What's your theory about what happened to him? For those who don't know, he was married to Martina
Castro.
And they had the big rancho Soquel.
Yes. One thing people don't seem to realize when they idolized Martina was the fact that when you got married in those days, the man became the big owner of everything you had. And even though in the Spanish system, she retained everything that she owned, in the American system, Michael Lodge became the Lord and Master, and he was very proud of her trees, the fact that they had a lot of trees, and he was making a lot of money for them by selling off these trees. They did the barter system. He would barter trees for whatever he needed.
Now this is redwood trees.
Redwood trees, I presume, and lumber. I'm not sure if it was a lumber that went through a lumber mill or just trees that they had to have milled. I just don't know. But he was very proud of that. And then he went off, like everybody else, to make his fortune in the gold fields, and decided early on that he couldn't make it from picking, shoveling in the gold, so he started merchandising, and he did quite well. And then they decided to come back to Soquel. When he decided, he sold everything and had quite a bit of money on him. And it is figured that somewhere between there and here, somebody jumped him for his money and probably put him in a mine where he'd never see the light of day. His body would never, and they never recovered his body that I know of. But then Martina was here, and she was in Lord and Master of her own plot. I think that she thought a lot more of herself than maybe it warranted. She'd had so many children, and as Sandy Lydon said, there was no dental work. She didn't smile much. Maybe there was a reason, but this younger sailor from France jumped ship here, and she fell in love with him, I guess, or he swept her off his feet, and then she married him. But remember, Lord and Master, he sold her land. He sold it to Hihn for maybe $5,000, and then he promised her that she would sell the world. So he took her on she left all of her deeds and things with the church in San Francisco somewhere, a priest or a priesthood, or she said the church. And then they went to Hawaii, and he dumped her. And then finally she got back from Hawaii back to San Francisco, and she went to this church, a priest, to get her deeds and records, and they thought she was nuts. So they had her locked up as being crazy. And she didn't get out of that insane asylum until her son Jose went up there and got her out and brought her back here. But by then everybody thought she was crazy. And they apportioned her place off after the Civil War. They had people, government agents that came through and said she owned this and she owned that and she owned there. And she had evidently given her kids each a lot, a designated lot. And said she had about 8 girls. The names were all different. And but she died right there, just very close to where the Soquel Rancho was, I think at the home of one of her children.
Yeah, 1890, I think.
Yes, it was. It was in the paper, at just a little section that she was in the paper for that. And they never really gave her any credit after she got out of the insane asylum. I think they still thought she was slightly crazy. So.
How do you think things would have been different if Michael Lodge hadn't died?
Well, I don't know if Mr. Hihn would have been successful, because he got all of her land. He said that it would be, that nobody else could have used it because it took his expertise in building railroads to get that lumber out of there. And he could have something in his favor that really was there. It did take a lot of expertise, and he made a lot of money from it, and was known for his sharp practices. And the funny thing is that my insurance man, Mr. McDonald, told me, he was old and we were young, and he told us, we had bought from Thomas Prescott our lot, and he told us that, oh yeah, Prescott had worked under one of the accountants that worked for Hihn, And Prescott was known as being sharp. And I don't mean by that dishonest. It was just taking advantage of the edge of the sword. He worked out fine.
Did you ever get to meet and talk with any of the Lodge sisters?
Yes, when I was inspector at our Soquel precinct, one of the lodges was still voting there, and she would come in, Carrie Lodge. She would come in. She had very porcelain-like skin. I've heard that term a lot, but porcelain-like skin was not sallow. It was just like ivory or something. It was very, very, very nice. And she never spoke much, and she had eyes that just looked everything, took everything in, and she would sign our books. And I'm sure that she's the one. This was in the times when you had you took a big piece of paper to vote, and you would have a stamp in there that had an X on it, and you would stamp it in the ink pad, and then you would stamp your paper. Well, these papers sometimes had stamps way out of place. No way could you count them. And I always thought that maybe she was one of the ones that didn't know just quite where to stamp that. So, but she was lovely.
And she was a granddaughter, right?
Yes, she was a granddaughter. And I read her memoir. She said that her Michael Lodge was a captain of a whaling ship. And I wondered if she realizes that the whaling ships they had were just big rowboats, like the Portuguese had, not the big seven-masted schooners that plied to, and I looked for his entry into California by jumping ship. And the only one I could find was a copper-clad ship that came from Dublin at the right time, but it foundered off the coast of Peru. So I don't know if it ever got up this far or not. Couldn't tell.
So what have you found most interesting about area history?
I think the lodges was one of, because it interested me is why I went pursuing Michael. I looked in Dublin, Ireland for census figures that would have things on. The trouble was in 1800 when he was in Ireland, he was born somewhere around there. There was a trouble started, and Ireland died as a country, and England took Dublin became just a port that had no custom. Ships didn't come there anymore. It was not a world-class port anymore. So it was dying. So when he came, he could have gotten on any ship that sailed out of there, and I couldn't find any trace of him in Ireland. And Lodge was not exactly an Irish name either. It seemed to be more English than Irish. So I couldn't tell where he came from, and I couldn't find his trail to California. But it was fun looking.
1955, the terrible flood, and then there was one in 82.
Yes.
Do you remember that very well?
Very well, because in 55, it had rained, and it had rained, and it had rained, and we were home, and it was Christmas time. And so we decided, I got together with a friend of ours, families together, and we had a night where we were going to make Christmas decorations. And we made these paper folding bells that were very popular at the time. And we were on Cherryville Lane, and we folded, and we got ready to leave about 9 with all our children in the car. I had 3, she had 2, she had 3. And then we came out, and lo and behold, we had heard the sirens blowing and blowing and blowing, but it didn't mean anything to us. And then we got to Bates Creek, and what had been a placid little bridge was now a roaring river, and we were on the wrong side of the creek to get home. So, and a car had tried to go through it, and it was stuck in the middle with its door open, and it was half deep in water. And so we turned around and went back to our friends, and we had a longer sleepover than we had intended. But the next day, the water was down, the creek was ready, we could go through it, at least, and we got back home. But that same creek had washed through Soquel, had washed away the youth center, had it really created havoc. It was just everywhere, water was everywhere. It had backed up behind that block. It had blockaded right at Soquel Creek, at the bridge. But it didn't take the bridge out, but it took everything else out, went around it.
Well, you were lucky. It could have been very dangerous.
It could have been, and had we tried to go through the water, we would have had a worse scenario. So the 82 flood was bad, but it didn't affect us in any way that way. It was just a matter of trying to go around the creek instead of I don't know when the bridge was incapacitated. Perhaps it was both times where they had to rebuild the entrances to it. But when they take the bridge out, that really makes it very hard to get around. Of course, by then in '82 we had the freeway.
What about the '89 earthquake?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, we were eating dinner and it started shaking, and our globe fixture on the light came tumbling down and hit the mashed potatoes. And Danny headed out the door. My husband was a little infirm at the time, so I got up and was trying to help him with this rolling floor get out the door. And we had to be careful because we knew that there was a canopy over the door that would come down if it really got bad. But we got at least to the canopy in the doorway in between when the bad part of the quake stopped, and we could start assessing damage. And of course there were the aftershocks, so we didn't relax for quite a long time. And my husband had fixed up what he called his earthquake machine. That was his hobby, and it had just blown the paper rod off the machine, so we didn't get a copy of it at all. But the house was such a mess. The refrigerator had danced through the middle of the kitchen, and it had opened and shut its shelves so that the freezer food in the top had bounced out and bounced back into the bottom. And the rice had hit the floor with the soy sauce. I tell you, we had a big mess. When we finally got through the 3 inches of debris on the floor from the cupboards, we could tell that the acids from the food had riveted the linoleum up into little rivulets. It was really ruined. It was bad.
But the house itself in pretty good shape?
Half of our fireplace went down, the top. We lost it, but it went out, not in, which was good. And we had big cracks in the walls, but fortunately we could plaster over the cracks, and we didn't need, you could see where the wood had twisted, but it didn't separate more than it should have. So it was pretty bad.
Is there something else you would like to share with us?
Well, the unusual circumstances of my grandfather. Here is his picture. But this is my grandfather was born in 1849. Do the math, and here it is, 2017. He married my grandmother as a second wife. He had a first wife and 3 children. She was 15 in this picture, 15 or 16. And we thought this was a wedding picture when I really looked at it closely, and I discovered that her buttons were unbuttoned. Down near her stomach level. So I realized that she was pregnant with her first child, and she had 15 children, and he had 3 before, so it was really, he had 18. She had 15. My father was the youngest of her 15 children, and I'm the youngest of his. So that's how I got to have such an odd grandfather. He died in 1912. I was born in 1926, so I never got to see him. So it was just an odd and unusual circumstance. Most people would have him as a great-grandfather at least.
Interesting.
It is to me.
Well, they had big families in those days.
Yes, they did. And my other grandmother had, well, she had 15, but it was a later time. They were a generation later than my first grandmother, my father's grandmother, my father's mother.
Well, thank you so much for granting this interview and being part of the Capitola Memories Project.
I hope it's been at least useful.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Capitola, come to the coast with me. The sun and the sky are free. We'll play in the sand and sea. Capitola, paradise you'll adore. I'll take your hand there on the sand along the shore. Capitola, over the bridge we'll go. We'll capture the sunset glow and wait for the creek to flow. Capitola, sway to the ocean's roar. Beside the strand we'll hear the band